Introduce Denis Dutton, who's a professor of aesthetics and philosophy of art at University of Canterbury in New Zealand. And he founds and edits the highly successful Johns Hopkins University Press Journal on Philosophy and Literature. And he also conceives and continues to edit Arts and Letters Daily, which you may enjoy. It's one of the most heavily trafficked websites anywhere for news and opinion in science, arts, and ideas. Denis.
Thanks very much. Because I was coming to Google, I thought it would be fun to put a tie on. Whenever I go to a New York law firm, I always go in jeans and an open shirt. I don't know, it's a bit of a contrarian view maybe, but actually I'm going to give you some contrarian ideas today. And because of two non-functioning printers, I'm going to try to read this actually off a computer screen, which is not always going to be easy, but I hope you'll bear with me. What I want to offer you today, and Sue's actually in my bag, there's a copy of the book. Well, no, sorry, the bag's down here. What I want to offer you today is a very different way of looking at the arts and at criticism from what we're accustomed to. And I think what I'm offering has more validity, more power, and more possibilities than the obscure, jargon-ridden, politically top-heavy discourse that deadens so much of the humanities, and some of you might have experienced it as undergraduates or in graduate school. I think it's time to look at the arts in light of Charles Darwin's theory of evolution. It's time to talk about an instinct for art, or if you will, an ensemble of instincts, capacities, and pleasures, which are instinctual, which are behind the arts. And I don't mean the art instinct as a metaphor. I'm not talking about loose symbols. I mean it as a deep human reality, as the best way to begin to understand the true nature of the arts. Now, I know a lot of people find this odd. Maybe not younger people in this room, but certainly academics of my age. Because, you know, I mean, I teach aesthetics. I know that since Plato and Aristotle, philosophers have been asking what beauty is and whether artistic values are purely cultural or whether they're somehow scientifically objective, universal, intrinsic, and unchanging. And for about 40 years in the academy, the zeitgeist, the whole climate of opinion has been heavily against that idea. I'm talking about English classes, art history, cultural studies, anthropology, and sociology. The view has been that the position I'm going to describe to you is dead wrong. There can be no hardwired art instinct, no hardwired basis for art. The prevailing idea has been that all of our artistic values and our senses of the beautiful, they have to be senses because they're individual to individual cultures, are actually socially constructed. I don't think this has ever been proven, but it sort of has been underwritten by any number of urban legends and kinds of stories that people will tell. You know, when I was an undergraduate at UCSB, you know, I was actually taught and continued and even taught my students when I was later at the University of Michigan that the Eskimos had hundreds of words for snow. And of course, if they have hundreds of words for snow and we only have, you know, something when you add things together, maybe 22 or 25, something like that, it would follow that, that they live in a completely different experiential world with their snow than we do. And even to try to understand their world would probably be imperialistic and colonialist, even to try, as I say. Or the story that was told about the African tribesman who was shown for the first time a photograph, couldn't read the photograph. They couldn't see that it was a photograph of a person. You know, they hadn't been enculturated, they hadn't learned to read photographs or hadn't taken courses in photography on the theory of Roland Barthes or whatever it is. And, you know, after I went to New Guinea and actually lived with people and studied the more absurd this entire idea became, I can talk about it if you want to ask questions about it. Or something which, last Friday I had dinner with Steve Pinker, and it turns out that even he was suckered by this one. And this is the story of the audience for Ravi Shankar in San Francisco, which assembles for the concert. Ravi Shankar comes out and he starts to tune his sitar, and he tunes and he worries about things and tunes and further tunes. And when he's finally done tuning, everybody applauds. And then that's because everybody thought it was a piece of music. Well, I'll say something about that. What I did was, after undergraduate years, was to go to India as a Peace Corps volunteer and spent a couple of years in village India. And I just had the feeling that this just wasn't working. That, of course, a South Indian, caste-ridden Hindu society that speaks a Dravidian language is not North Hollywood, California. But it's not something you can't understand. The same human vices, human passions, human foolishness, interests, concern for children, romantic concerns, you name it. It's all there. Of course, it's peculiarly Indian, but that doesn't mean that it's not understandable. You know, and what I did was that I started myself to study the sitar. I studied the sitar with a man named Panduran Parate in Hyderabad, and I've been playing the sitar for 40 years. I mean, I can actually get myself a free meal in an Indian restaurant by plucking the sitar for maybe half an hour. They'll do that in the city where I live. What I discovered was, I mean, it was beautiful to have the entire repertoire of the sitar, which I do love the North Indian sitar in particular, open to me. But Indian music in that respect is no more different from our music than Carlo Gesualdo is different from Duke Ellington. I mean, you can understand both. I dare say Ellington could have understood Gesualdo, and with a little practice, even the other way around. You know, rhythmic drive, harmonic anticipation, lucid structure, divinely sweet melody, that, you know, it cuts across cultures with ease. And by the way, as for that urban legend about Ravi Shankar, no one who sits through the tuning of a sitar at the beginning of a concert, no matter how stoned they are in San Francisco, could possibly mistake that for the music. If you've ever seen a guitar or a violin tuned, you know what he's doing. The thing is, it takes a long time. And when you've come for the concert and it's taking a long time, of course, you know, when the person's done and Ravi Shankar looks out at the audience and does that with his head, you know that, that it's time for the music to begin. So everybody applauded. But then some jerk of a journalist probably took a course in cultural studies at Berkeley, reported to the world media that the audience thought that was the first piece of music. But I can tell you, this entire field, as a philosopher, I've discovered, is fraught with fallacious ethnography, in fact, ethnological malpractice virtually. Where anthropologists have tried to describe local customs as so different from what we have in our culture that we couldn't possibly understand them. I'll say something about that in a second. Just say that philosophy has never been much of a help in understanding this either, if you excuse me. Oh, it's got bubbles. Watch out, be careful. Philosophers like to, and if you've taken courses in philosophy, in ethics, or in aesthetics, you know that philosophers like to rationalize our intuitions. What they do is take a sort of intuitive worldview in ethics that you get from Kant or from Aristotle or from John Stuart Mill, and you then sort of build a rational system around it. You make it consistent. You show, perhaps, as Kant tried to do, that it is the only consistent value system that is consistent with the way the world is put together and the one that we therefore ought to adopt. Other people say other things. This rationalist sort of impulse in philosophy is very strong. And the intuitions on which it's based are important. But the one thing the philosophers never ask about, and I can say this based on a career in that subject, is they don't ask where the intuition came from. They don't actually wonder why it is that they're just repeatedly inclined to make these kinds of value judgments, or that those kinds of value judgments are made all over the world. I mean, it shows in puzzles and problems that I've talked about in the art instinct, such as the problem of forgery. If a painting has been loved for years and everybody thinks it's a wonderful painting, one day it's discovered to be a forgery and it's relegated to the basement. What's wrong with the painting? You know, why? There's a long discussion of that, which I'm not going to be able to go into this afternoon, but a long discussion of that particular set of intuitions. Well, the only way I think we can get to understand the institutions is actually to treat our artistic and aesthetic intuitions as adaptations. That is to say, as innate systems of pleasures and capacities and interests which come up over and over again all over the world and which make it possible for us to understand the arts of other cultures and other cultures to understand our arts in order to sort of intercultural communication is possible and the sort of universal constituents of the arts are possible. I'm going to talk about those in a second. But one more crack at the anthropologist before I go on. You may have one day been in a class or a seminar and somebody said, oh yes, but they don't have our concept of art. They have a different concept of art. And I, spend some time on that subject. I mean, the first place to ask, if somebody says that about anything, they don't have our concept of doorstop. Oh, they don't? Well, what do they have then? Well, they have these things, but it's not our concept of doorstop. Well, do they put them by doors to keep the doors open or to keep them closed? No, they don't do that. It doesn't have any. Well, why did you call it a doorstop? The very fact that anthropologists are given to saying things like, they don't have our concept of art, means it must have something in common with our concept of art to even have said that in the first place. So you can't have it both ways. And if it has something in common, what does it have in common? One particular obnoxious example that I examine in the book, for example, is a claim made that a certain North Indian culture of women who were preparing decorations on walls preparatory to marriage of some local young woman, where they paint the walls with a certain kind of jaunty painting and decorate them. The anthropologist in this case compares that with New York gallery painting like Rothko's and Diebenkorn's hanging in museums, and comes to the rather politically predictable conclusion that Indian women who are preparing for a marriage in this way are putting these decorations on walls. They're not signing them. There's no money involved. It's an act of love. It shows a communal spirit that's very warm and fuzzy. When you compare it then to the high-priced careerism of New York galleries, well, that looks rather bad, greedy and awful. But of course, the comparison is absurd. The comparison is not between what the Indian women are doing in trousseau arts in India, but what American women or French women or German women or Spanish women do in preparation for marriages in their culture. And in fact, they decorate and they knit and they make wedding cakes and they prepare all sorts of artistic and decorated artifacts, and that's the proper comparison base. And when you put that together, what you see is a universal phenomenon of cultures that sort of welcome a marriage, have all sorts of symbolism involved with fecundity and children involved with it and having babies and the rest of it. And when you look at it that way, it's not at all exotic what they're doing. To compare it with Diebenkorn's hanging in New York galleries is just a falsification. I can tell you that I've spent some years on this, and there is lots of that kind of falsification that goes on when these cross-cultural comparisons are made. But I'll go on. So, I mean, what really finally got me going on this was a decision I made in the early 1990s to go to Northern New Guinea. My wife said, okay, find out if they really have our concept of art or not. So I found a village in Northern New Guinea that I was able to locate through some people I knew in Sydney, Australia, and went there and spent some weeks living with carvers, traveling up and down the Sepik, By that time, I'd already developed a passion for oceanic art and for New Guinea art, so I knew what the best pieces were in European collections. I knew what curatorial opinion was and connoisseurship meant for Sepik and New Guinea art in Europe and in Australia and the US. So I wanted to find out if the Sepik carvers had the same artistic standards, not compared to the most benighted tourists who came in. Of course, that's their first sort of acquaintance with the art. But the most knowledgeable and sophisticated Westerners who had never been to New Guinea, I knew what their standards were. How did it compare with the Sepik carvers themselves? What I found was, you know, after having studied carving, one of the interesting byproducts of that field work was that there is somewhere in a museum or gallery or living room a genuine Sepik mask carved by me. But what I found was that the aesthetic comparisons were almost coincident. That is to say, the values seem to be the same. What Europeans would call a great carving is what they would call a great carving. And when you put the most knowledgeable Europeans and the most knowledgeable New Guinean carvers together, what you get is something that's very close. All right, very close in terms of what? What are the universal characteristics of art such that we identify them and use them as a basis for a systematic cross-cultural aesthetics? I give an extended discussion of what I call a cluster concept of art. And this is a discussion which has these 12 features, extensively discussed with each of them. I'll just mention most of them and digress with a couple. For one thing, works of art provide people all over the world and everywhere with direct pleasure. It's not pleasurable for something. It's not a means pleasure. It's a pleasure which is an end in itself. Works of art tend to be made in styles. And the style can be highly naturalistic or it can be highly, as we say, stylized. That is to say, away from naturalism. But style is important in art. There's an economy of style. There's a reason for having styles, too, which is a very interesting separate question. Works of art tend to have what you could call expressive individuality. That is to say, the best works of art on the Sepik, in the Chinese tradition, in the Japanese tradition, and in all of the Western tradition, give you a sense that there's someone behind it, some individual. You know, that's somehow the personality of Beethoven back there. That's Jane Austen's wisdom and her craft and her high intelligence and her grace and wit. The sense that there's a person behind it is very important. And the Japanese have that, the Chinese have that, the Indians have it. Of course, it's sometimes hard to get in large art genres. I mean, it's very difficult to recognize it unless you're an expert working in a small area with ancient Egyptian art, which tends to just sort of meld together as a kind of style. But I would bet that if we look carefully enough, we'd find it there too, because we find it everywhere else. Works of art are characterized by creativity and novelty. Just perfectly straightforward. Works of art tend to be surrounded by an atmosphere of criticism. That is to say, works of art are important enough to people in ways that people want to talk critically about them, and they produce traditions of criticism. These traditions can be extremely complicated, as they are in our culture. Criticism around painting, for example, or music. In New Guinea, I noticed that there was very little of what we would call aesthetic criticism, though there were just judgments, yes and no. A lot of the critical talk among carvers in particular was always shop talk about the qualities of wood. You know, oh, I saw a great log coming down the river the other day. Missed it. You know, got out to sea. I was there when that happened once. It was quite tragic. A log, which was an extremely hardwood old log that had come from way up the river in some ancient forest that had fallen over, and they couldn't get it, and it went out into the Bismarck Sea. Intellectual challenge. Works of art tend to occupy a lot of the brain. That is to say, they and the fact that they're using a lot of the brain is in fact a source of pleasure. The way in which they throw up puzzles, the way in which They bring lots of elements together, so at the end of the symphony you're hearing themes you heard at the beginning, but they're transformed. It requires a sharp mind to get it, and it gives pleasure when you do get it. Art traditions and institutions. Works of art are made in traditions and institutions. More recently, many aestheticians have claimed that the institutions are all you need to talk about to explain all of art. I think that's entirely wrong. What we need is a naturalistic base for the aesthetic response. Works of art tend to be characterized by emotional saturation. In varying degrees, the experience of works of art is shot through with emotion. Now, this emotion is sometimes incited by the work, as, let's say, you know, golly, a plane crash or a sports game can incite emotion. But what I mean is more what I was talking about before with expressive individuality, expressed emotion. The sense that you get from the Brahms Fourth Symphony of just that melancholy sense of that particular symphony. Something quite distinct. In Hindi, it's rasa, the idea that, that a work of art has its own flavor, if it's much good. Okay, now just three very important ones. Representation. In widely varying degrees of naturalism or of accuracy, art objects, including sculptures, paintings, and oral and written narratives, and sometimes even music, represent or imitate real and imaginary experiences in the world. It was Aristotle who first pointed this out brilliantly in the Poetics. I mean, the Poetics is where a lot of this starts, because Aristotle had an extremely imaginative and acute sense of the response to works of art. Human beings, he said, take an irreducible pleasure in representation. A realistic painting, I would say, of the folds of a red satin dress, a detailed model of a steam engine, or the tiny plates, silverware, goblets, and lattice-crust cherry pie on the dinner table of a doll's house. They delight us. We love those things. Delight in imitation in any medium, including, of course, stories and fiction, or video games, anything that can actually imitate the world or make an imaginary world, which is to some degree like a real world that you can experience, is part of the appeal of art. Skill and virtuosity. Next. The making of the object or the performance requires or demonstrates or displays, as I'll say, the exercise of specialized skills. They might be skills that are learned in an apprentice tradition. They might be something like folk singing that everybody learns. And wherever they are, even in societies where everybody learns it, there usually are individuals who stand out as especially talented. You know, take a dancing class and you'll note that there's one or two people there that somehow are very good at it. We always have this kind of heritability of abilities. Skill is absolutely intrinsic to the arts worldwide. And the kinds of skills that we get from writers or carvers or dancers or composers can cause jaws to drop, hair to stand up on the back of the neck, and eyes to flood with tears. The demonstration of skill is one of the most deeply moving and pleasurable aspects of the arts, so much so that people pay big bucks simply to see skill displays. If you think about it, it's strange. I mean, this is almost unremarked by many modernist and postmodernist, well, I'd say ideologues. But people just don't want to talk about it. It's as though skill has somehow something we don't really want to talk about. Skill is a lower status form of pleasure that we don't acknowledge in the higher echelons of art criticism. Special focus. Works of art are bracketed off from real life. This is something you find everywhere. They're at the back of the cave with lights in the Pleistocene or in Hindu caves today. It's what Ellen Dissanayake calls making special. The gold curtain stage, a plinth in a museum, spotlights, ornate picture frames, illuminated showcases, book jackets and typography, ceremonial aspects of public concerts and displays, an audience's expensive clothes, the performer's black tie, the presence of the czar in his royal box, even the high price of the tickets. You know, this is, in fact, part of the sheer over-the-top expense and wastefulness of art, which is part of making special, is something that I think is important, and I'll have a word to say about it before I end. And finally, what possibly is the most important characteristic on the entire list, imaginative experience. The works of art provide imaginative experience for both producers and audiences. A marble carving may realistically represent an animal, but as a work of sculptural art, it becomes an imaginative object. Aristotle dealt with the challenge that what people like in representations is what it's a representation of. And what Aristotle pointed out is that that can't possibly be true, because things that would repel people in real life, snakes or spiders, will be relished where you have a marble carving of a snake or a gold brooch in the form of a spider. I mean, my favorite example is to think of the kitchen and a bowl of fruit, perhaps, in the kitchen with a ripe peach in the center of it, and then imagine a big black horsefly walking over it. Oh, it's really not the most appealing idea, is it? Put it in a Dutch 17th century painting of a bowl of fruit, and it's absolutely delightful. We like, Aristotle said, representations. The same can be said of any story well told, whether mythology or personal history. The costume firelight dance, or the dance by firelight, with its intense unity of purpose among performers, possesses an imaginative element quite beyond the group exercise of factory workers. They don't make you exercise here at Google, I hope, like these Japanese factories. All art in this way happens in a make-believe world. All art, I'm talking about the Beethoven symphonies, the novels of Dostoevsky, Homer, Grand Theft Auto 4. It's all happening in the theater of the mind, the theater of the imagination. Now, what I think you get out of a list like this is quite amazing. All you need to do is start testing it with all of the artistic experiences that you have across the realm of your own experience, and what you think about in other countries and other cultures and through history, and you begin to see a unity in it. This is a kind of a naturalist description of art as a natural phenomenon. I mean, it's like war or status or the family. Yes, there are around the edges of these things some, was that a war or was that just a skirmish? You can worry about marginal cases. The problem with philosophical aesthetics for 40 years is that it has thought that if it could simply decide the most extreme outliers, Duchamp's fountain, the urinal on the plinth, or the various provocations and outrage, if it had a definition that dealt with them, it would have also dealt with Rembrandt's Night Watch, or the Liszt's Spanish Rhapsody, or the Brecht plays. What we need to do is get back to the center. If you want to do a philosophical investigation and ask the question, what is murder? You don't begin by deciding whether voluntary euthanasia or abortion are murder. Those are the outside cases that you look at last. What I want to do for aesthetics is get back to the center, get away from Duchamp and modernist provocations and Jeff Koons, and get back to the center. And once you go back and start looking at the center and look at it cross-culturally, well, hey, it is possible actually to say some things about it. Now, it's my view that what gives this uniformity to the arts worldwide is an ensemble of Darwinian adaptations, which together make an art instinct. An adaptation, I remind you, is an inherited biological or behavioral characteristic that reliably develops in an organism, or a person in our case, increasing its chances of survival and reproduction. So, why do we have eyes or ears or a circulatory system or a pancreas? Well, we have it because it was successful in allowing our direct ancestors to survive and to reproduce in prehistory. In terms of a Darwinian account, I mean, what we want to know is how we can reverse engineer our artistic tastes. We want to take what we know about the tastes in the world universally today and see if we can reverse engineer what good they would have been for survival and reproduction in the Pleistocene. The three marks of an adaptation, which I think are important in connection with the arts, are these. Three most important things to think about. The Darwinian adaptations, or perhaps extensions of adaptations, or modifications of adaptations, or intensification of adaptations that make up the arts can be identified by the fact that they give pleasure, because the arts everywhere give pleasure. That doesn't mean happy-face pleasure. It might be a kind of higher satisfaction that you get from Shakespeare's Lear, which is not, you don't leave the theater happy, but you leave the theater somehow satisfied. Pleasure, universality, and spontaneous development. Universality meaning you find it everywhere where human beings come together and form societies, and that these things spontaneously develop. The Pleistocene, I should point out, is the 1.6 million years where we developed. If you begin your ancestors at the beginning of the Pleistocene, if you met them today, if they walked into Google, you'd call the SPCA or the zoo and have them bring some, tranquilizer darts. If they walked in at the end of that time, 10,000 years ago, the beginning of the Holocene and the Pleistocene, then you'd call security or the Immigration and Naturalization Service. That is to say, we became human in the Pleistocene. We actually gained the bodies that we have based on the bodies of pre-Pleistocene ancestors, but more importantly, we developed the human personality with human interests. I'll say a little bit about that in a minute. Just say, we developed our likes, our dislikes, and our fears. Excuse me. Thank you. Real water. Oh, good. Thanks. These are the features then that help us to survive and reproduce. As adaptations for survival, they are joined by our innate emotions, including likes, dislikes, and fears, as I've just said. This includes our general fear of high places, our wariness around snakes or animals with big teeth. And if somebody puts their hand up and says, but I'm not afraid of snakes, these are heritable. All we can say is that our ancestors, there is a general fear of snakes, and that our ancestors are the ones who were afraid of snakes, and they're the ones who survived. We have lots of ancestors. If you think through that 80,000 generations of the Pleistocene, we have lots of ancestors who weren't afraid of snakes, who were maybe a little bit careless about walking at the edges of cliffs, for whom fat and sweet wasn't that important, and who took little pleasure in sexual adventures. Those are our aunties and uncles 80,000 generations ago. Our direct grandmothers all the way back and grandfathers all the way back are the ones who actually were a little bit wary around snakes, afraid of high places, liked sweet and fat, and liked sex. But there's lots of other things they liked. They liked puzzles of all kind. They liked imagination. They liked certain kinds of landscapes, which I'll talk about at the very end. But if you put this all together, I think what you get here is something that, well, let me just give you an example. Something that looks pretty solidly like an adaptation. Think of the intrinsic pleasure that we take in representations and the way that the pleasures of the arts happen in the theater of the mind. Storytelling is one of the most ancient of the arts and is absolutely universal. It arises spontaneously everywhere. It is a source of great pleasure. In fact, there was a British survey a few years ago, and I assume it applies here and elsewhere, that the average Briton spends 6% of all waking life enjoying fictions of some kind, either reading, I think it left books out. I guess they don't read enough. But anyway, when you just put all the television and movies and theater together, what you get is 6%. I think the number was actually higher if you added in books, reading novels. Now, 6% of your time, which is spent doing something which has no return, and which is highly pleasurable, obviously, for people, needs an explanation. It cries out for an explanation. The ability to imagine scenarios and states of affairs not present to direct consciousness must have had an adaptive power in human prehistory, as it does in today's world. We imagine where we were last month, what we plan to do tomorrow, where the car keys were, you know, what it would have been like if I'd married that person or taken that job. Imagination allows the weighing of indirect evidence, making chains of inference for what might have been or what might be. It allows for intellectual stimulation and forecasting, the working up of solutions, but it does it without high cost. That is to say, telling stories about lions as a way of learning about lions is a lot safer than actually going and fooling with lions to learn about them. So, I mean, low-cost experimentation is very important for fiction. Would have been very important for Pleistocene hunter-gatherers. The capacity for strategic, prudential, conditional thinking gave hunter-gatherer bands a vast adaptive advantage over groups that could not plan with imaginative detail. Remember, it's just like what they say, you know, about the history of wars are always written by the victors. You know, we are the descendants of the victors. We're the descendants of the people who could plan, the people who actually could outfight and outwit their slower, stupider neighbors. You know, and where do you get from it? Well, you get to the Googleplex, among other places. I said that spontaneous development was important for recognizing an adaptation. And I think one way to point that out is to take something like this. This is a rather charming account, I think, by the psychologist Alan Leslie of his experimental work, on evolutionary psychology by Pascal Boyer. And if you just think about this, what I'm describing here, this is the point, the moral of the story, cannot be learned by a 3-year-old unless a 3-year-old somehow already knows how to do it. It requires innate capabilities which simply could not be taught to a 3-year-old. It's about a tea party in an experimental situation where there's an experimenter with a child, the 3-year-old, having tea. Children pretend pour, pretend tea, out of an empty teapot into several teacups. They are careful to align the spout of their teapot with the cup, because in the pretend scenario, liquids fall downwards as they do in the real world. This aspect of the scenario is handled with intuitive physics, as if there were real liquid in the pot. Then the experimenter, the adult who's there, playing with the child, knocks over one of the cups, laments the fact that the pretend tea is spilled out all over the table, and asks the child to refill the empty cup. Now, 3-year-olds faced with this situation, that is to say with 2 actually empty cups, one of which is also pretend empty, do not make mistakes. The child will pretend fill only the pretend empty one and not the actually empty one that is also pretend full. Think about it. This kind of virtuoso performance is involved in all situations of pretense. And children do it with complete fluency. The children has the tea party, goes and watches a Roadrunner cartoon on television, talks about what happened yesterday, imagines what she'll do tomorrow, goes and plays in her room, has dinner, and all of these different worlds, and different imaginary worlds, and fantasy worlds, and doesn't even mix them. That is something you can't teach a 3-year-old. That's something the 3-year-old has to have. You could say, just in summary, that stories provide low-cost, low-risk surrogate experience. They satisfy a need to experiment with answers to what-if questions, to deal with the problems and threats of the world that were thrown before our ancestors. And by actually being able to do it and get pleasure out of it, we were the greatest survivors, or we're the descendants of the greatest survivors. Stories also can be richly instructive. Sources of factual or putatively factual information might be religious or mythological. But actually, the didactic purpose of storytelling is very important, and that continues. I mean, people read airport novels in part because it tells them about the oil industry or how Marines, invaded Iwo Jima or whatever. That is to say, historical events, historical novels are fun because you gain factual information. People actually like facts. They like new information. That's why they call it the news. I don't tire of reminding people that the news is a plural. News is a plural. It's all the new things. Stories encourage us to explore the points of view, the motivations, and the values of other human minds, inculcating potentially adaptive interpersonal and social capacities. They extend mind-reading capabilities that begin in infancy and come into full flower in adult sociality. Stories provide regulation for social behavior. That is another thing which is very important and which I think is terrifically interesting. How much time should we look for here?
1 o'clock.
1 o'clock, thank you. All right, well, then I would have time to say something about something else which is of great interest to us, and that is storytellers. Because we're not just interested in the stories, we're interested in the stories as they seem to us to actually give us a sense of a storyteller with great skill. I mean, works of art are often virtuoso displays. A pianist's performance, let's say the Liszt Mephisto waltz, or a soprano hitting a high E flat, or the consummate sort of skill of a storyteller like Mark Twain or Jane Austen or Tolstoy. It is human intelligence and creativity that transforms appealing landscape scenes and plot outlines into works of painterly or literary art. And the problem with this is that what I've said about storytelling up till now, and this is, as I say, just part of the book, but what I've said about storytelling up till now is about how it would have had a sort of functional survival value in the Pleistocene. But that won't do as a full explanation of works of art, will it? Because works of art are among the most opulent, extravagant, glittering, and profligate creations of the human mind. The arts, storytelling, squander brain power, physical efforts by many arts, and all sorts of precious resources. This was a problem for Darwin. After he wrote The Origin of Species, he wrote to Asa Gray, a friend, that he'd been much bothered by the problem of the eye, the human eye, but now it was actually the peacock's tail that when he looked at it, it made him sick. And of course, the peacock's tail is a real problem for evolution. That is to say, natural selection is economical, it's abstemious, it gets to a solution to a problem that is the most efficient. The peacock's tail actually is so huge, so gaudy, that it makes it harder for peacocks to survive in the forests of Southeast Asia where they're native. They're more subject to predation with this gigantic tail. Well, what's the point of the peacock's tail? The peacock's tail is a fitness signal. It is produced by the peacock because of, who's responsible? Peahen choices. Peahens are actually choosing the peacocks with the biggest tails as the objects of conjugation. And they're the ones who are actually, by their choices, producing the peacocks with bigger and bigger tails. Well, so it goes for all of this extravagant plumage that you find in the bird world. It's almost always males who have it. And often, typically, the female of the species is a small brown bird which can get into a nest and is very conservative and doesn't go out. But when it's her job to make a choice of who she mates with the most gaudy males. This runaway process of sexual selection is, I think, in terms of what happened with human beings, almost a kind of human self-domestication in the Pleistocene. That is to say, while human beings were domesticating alpacas and dogs and taking ancient cattle species and turning them into the modern bovine beasts that we know that are docile, They were making choices about who actually to allow to survive and who to eat with these animals. They were also making other extremely important choices during those 80,000 generations, who to mate with. And in so doing, what they did was to make choices which produced the human personality as we now do it. You know, natural selection is really a matter of surviving in a hostile environment, or surviving, you know, various depredations and breakdowns of your body. But sexual selection is a matter of being sufficiently charming to the opposite sex to reproduce. And both of these things are going on. We were talking about this at Santa Barbara the other day. I mean, in a sense, natural selection is, let's say, about things that are hidden and physiological. Sexual selection is about things that are open and public. Natural selection is about sperm. Sexual selection is about charm. And you can have all the sperm in the world, but if you've got no charm, well, you've got a problem. And you have all the charm in the world, and you've got no sperm, you have a problem. That's really, it's this natural selection and sexual selection together which make the whole of Darwin's theory of evolution. So, again, what are the kind of things you get out of sexual selection? Well, the famous waist to hip ratio preferred by men and women, which is not quite an hourglass, but maybe a little bit more like a Coke bottle. The fact that women worldwide tend to prefer older men on average, and that men tend to prefer younger women. This is variable across the globe, you know, from Zimbabwe to Iran to the United States and Canada, where it's very close. This desire for the older male is, and other countries like Iran, it's very large. But in no country in the world is it reversed. On average, do women prefer younger men. Intelligence is very important. Intelligence is very important for both sexes. Having resources is more important for women thinking about men than the other way around. And I'll go through, I won't be able to go through all of this if you talk about the evolved personality in terms of the desirability of adaptability, generosity, dependability, industriousness, creativity, and a sense of humor. Sense of humor is very important in courtship contexts. I think it is universal. It's absolutely universal. I've seen it in New Guinea that teenage girls kind of like to look down like this and say, when they're talking about some guy, he's funny. That he's funny line is universal. Well, I think that the evolved sexually selected aspects of the human personality are innate parts of our response to works of art. Because works of art evolved as expressions of individuals, important in courtship context, but going far beyond courtship context. That is to say, you don't read Jane Austen with admiration because of any courtship interest in her. She lived a long time ago and wouldn't have been interested in you anyway. What happens is that many of these values are infect the arts. One of them is quite interesting, and I'd like to say something about that, and that is resource signaling wastefulness. That is to say, you know, the whole point of courtship, of wastefulness in courtship, is that you show up on the date with the girl, and what do you bring her? You bring her flowers, which are pointless and expensive. You bring her chocolates, which are just empty calories. You know, if she's really lucky, she gets a diamond, and you know, which is, again, just it's not even as shiny as a zircon or something like that. But the point is that it shows that you have the resources to spend money on useless things. You take her to a restaurant, you know, you buy very expensive little tiny plates of food. And typically, if you're a male, you over-tip when you're with a woman. I mean, tipping behavior has been widely studied. Think about it for a second, if natural selection controlled human courtship, you'd show up at her apartment on the date with a nice big potato, you know, or perhaps if you're, you know, more imaginative, a ratchet wrench set, something like that. And then you'd go to an all-you-eat restaurant, all-you-can-eat restaurant, and you know, you'll do that. You will do that after you've had children. Some of the best work on this was done actually right in Palo Alto 100 years ago, over 100 years ago, by Thorstein Veblen, who wrote The Theory of the Leisure Class, which is a prescient, wonderful book in many ways, often misread, I think, in the 20th century as a anti-capitalist diatribe or something. He had a great sense of the importance of cost as actually adding to our sense of beauty. Now, that's a very disagreeable thing for me to say. I, like everyone else, like every middle-class person I know, you know, had my children go through the museum. Oh, how much did that cost, Daddy? Or, you know, is that worth a lot of money? No, no, no. It's about the actual beauty of the thing. It's worth money because it's beautiful. So I'm against this, but like nepotism, I'm afraid it's probably built into the human personality that we associate waste with and cost with beauty. He said so, Thorstein Veblen said so, and I've come more to believe him, but to believe that it has to do with the situation in the Pleistocene. He says that, you know, works of art will frequently be made, this is what I say. Let me start again. If we take what Veblen says and we apply it to Darwin and we look at the whole Darwinian situation, what I would come up with is a few predictions about what would be the case with the arts. Here they are. Works of art will frequently be made of rare or expensive materials. Gold, silver, clear jade, marble that's difficult to transport especially. Fine hardwoods, unusual pigments, rare dyes such as the Tyrian purple of classical antiquity. Works of art should be very time-consuming to create. In that sense, they may demonstrate that the maker has leisure, conspicuous leisure, in a way that indirectly indicates that he possesses wealth or status. Even if a work of art is quickly executed, the skills to make it should have been time-consuming or difficult to acquire. And these admired skills are very often involve manual skills, manual dexterity. You know, people say, he painted every hair. You know, she never missed a note. Interesting that that kind of technique has been out in painting in the 20th century, but absolutely required for instrumental performance. You know, what a different views you have of skill in those two arts, side by side in the same century. A sense of waste can be emphasized if a work of art is made that is fleeting. The perfect centerpiece for an expensive dinner party may be a poignantly lovely ice sculpture. I mean, marble's fine, but it has the disadvantage that it's going to be just as beautiful next week. Ice is great because you know it's going to be gone. And in addition to time, the sheer brains and energy needed to produce Picasso's or Wagner's oeuvre is bound, like the pyramids, to impress us. You know, handmade will always be better than machine-made in the arts, even if machines make more symmetrical, cleaner, shinier, better things. That it's handmade will be important to us. And what that shows is that there's some kind of underlying adaptation having to do with handmade. Well, there's a lot more I could talk about, including landscape preferences, but I think I'm just about out of time, and I want to thank you very much.
Welcome to Google. Thank you for the very inspiring talk. When you mention universality, I cannot but think of the Ashmolean in Oxford, which displays its whole anthropological collection not by place of origin or a culture, but by utility. So you have, you know, like boxes full of different artifacts that are used daily.
Like the adzes from all these different cultures.
Exactly. Yes. So it's very interesting to see that side by side. I mean, it just twists your your whole
That's right,
brain.
and that's very interesting because I mean, if these cultures couldn't speak to each other, if they were incommensurable, is the favorite word to describe this. They'd have to put them in culture boxes. But of course, when you put them together in the way you're describing, well, my goodness.
Yeah. So, but my question would really be like, so how do we apply your theories here about evolution and the arts into pricing art and like into discovering budding young artists?
Well, I mean, that's I don't know that that my opinion about that would be much better than anybody else's, but it's obvious that any kind of wasteful display somehow seems to make something more important. I mean, if you take something like the Chuck Close self-portraits, which are in the Metropolitan Museum in New York, these are, in my opinion, fairly ho-hum modernist works, photorealist self-portraits of Chuck Close and portraits of other people. And they take up a huge amount of space in a gallery on Fifth Avenue in the Metropolitan Museum. And actually, they are proclaiming their beauty simply by the fact they're taking up so much space. You know, if they were in a disused linen factory in western Massachusetts, it wouldn't be quite the same. It had been turned into an art gallery. It's so complicated, and so many factors are at work in reputation and careerism. I think that the potential for fraudulence and kitsch in high modernist galleries is just immense. I just don't think there's much you can say about it. Because the thing is you can never, people who say, oh, well, that whole modern work, that's all they're all a bunch of criminals and frauds and the work isn't of any good. You can't be sure of that underneath that there isn't somebody that you'll come back to and come back to and come back to again and again. And in 50 or 100 years, you'll say, yes, there was something there. You know, that's the best I can do.
One more. So one adaptation that to me jumps out that you haven't mentioned, I was curious if you'd thought about it, is the value of artifice in itself, just the creation of objects. Is that something you've considered?
Oh, yes, absolutely. There's a section in the book on that very subject. The actual love of simply any kind of productive still, and the fact that we admire it so much, I think is fundamental. And I must say, you know, it's almost as though there's been, particularly in the last 40 years, almost a modernist ideology that's wanted to belittle or scold us for liking pure skill. We're supposed to like pure skill in music and in music execution, but we're not supposed to really care about it in painting. High status means it means that you're somehow beyond skill display. But I will just say one thing about that in the modern world. If you take something like well, many modernist works that seem to be, let's say, children's scribbles, or, you know, and they put them in a museum. The "my kid could do that" brigade comes in, you know, and they're always out there saying, "My kid could do that," and they confront the curator. The one thing I've noticed, there's one thing the curator never says. The curator never says, "Yeah, your kid could do that." The curator always says, "Oh, your kid couldn't do that. Your kid wouldn't know exactly how to throw that paint. Your kid wouldn't know exactly when to have accomplished this particular gesture historically at this particular moment in the art." This is actually a very, very sophisticated. Now, I'm not really knocking that in the sense that you know, it might be a very sophisticated thing in the art world. But what's interesting about that to me is that skill is still appealed to. You know, somehow skill is back there and the curator defends it in terms of skill, rather than the skill actually not counting anymore. It's just a different kind of skill. So I think it's an adaptation.